Child Welfare Virtual Expo 2018, collaborating to conduct a workforce needs assessment.
Hi and welcome back. We hope you were able to share your vision for child welfare on the virtual message board and also join the virtual chat in the exhibit hall. As a reminder, if you can see us in the closed captioning but you can't hear us or you're having a difficult time, adjust the speakers on your computer, or you can go to the help desk and they'll help you out. Thank you so much for attending our session today on collaborating to conduct a workforce needs assessment. My name is Ida Drury, and I'm from the Quality Improvement Center on Workforce Development, or the QIC-WD. And I'm joined today by Megan Paul, my colleague from the center, and also by two representatives from some of the sites for the QIC-WD. April Potts is here. She is an administrator at the state of Washington, and Kevin Haddock is a deputy director at the state of Oklahoma. And I'm going to turn it over to Megan now, and she's going to get us started, telling us a little bit about the Quality Improvement Center on Workforce Development, and then also giving a little bit of an overview for what we're going to be talking about today.
Thanks, Ida. So at the Quality Improvement Center, our overarching mission is to build knowledge to improve workforce outcomes. So we're using a couple different strategies to do this. The main one is that we are developing and testing interventions in child welfare agencies. So that is, we're doing rigorous research and evaluation to build evidence around what works. To do that, we've partnered with 8 child welfare sites across the nation, 2 of whom, as you have just heard, are here today to represent their sites. We're excited today to talk with you about the initial work that we've done with our sites to conduct a thorough workforce needs assessment to inform decisions about which interventions to test in each site. Our goal here today is to help you learn a little bit about the workforce needs assessment and think about how you might be able to implement it in your agency to inform workforce decisions without being a QIC-WD partner. Throughout the session, I'm going to provide some brief descriptions of the steps of our process. Ida is going to ask our site representatives to weigh in and give us their experiences, and we'll have a couple poll questions for you to weigh in. If you'd like to hear more or see more details about the process, I encourage you to take a look at the handouts that are available to you. They're pretty dense and have a lot of info for you to consider back at your office, and please go ahead and download those and look at them later on. If you'd like to learn more about the QIC-WD, check us out on the web at QIC-WD.org. Finally, when we're all done, we'll transition to the Learning Lab, where you can reflect on and chat with one another and with us about everything you've heard in the session today. So as you can see, we have got a 4-step process that we've used, or in the midst of using. We've borrowed this from the Permanency Innovations Initiative and adapted it for workforce initiatives. So we have exploration, installation, initial, and full implementation. And throughout each of these phases, there are important teaming and evaluation activities occurring as well. Now, within the exploration phase, which is where we're going to focus our time today, there are 6 steps. Initially, we want to identify the problem we want to solve and what outcomes and population we want to target. Obviously, we're already working within the realm of workforce issues and generally working with frontline staff. But the point of this exercise in steps 1 and 2 is to narrow it down to a more specific type of problem and a more specific type of population. So for example, turnover within the first year of employment, or certain workers in a certain region of your jurisdiction. The next steps involve identifying potential causes of your workforce challenge, barriers and facilitators, then developing a theory of change, and finally assessing and selecting a workforce intervention. Now, as I mentioned, teaming is really important. At the beginning of the project, we had each site develop an implementation team that included typically agency leadership, a site implementation manager, which is sort of a on-site project coordinator, a site data coordinator, who is our liaison sort of to human resources at HR data and child welfare data as well. Each team also includes key internal and external stakeholders, which is varied a bit across sites as they choose. And finally, each implementation team also has a 3-person team from the QIC-WD with specialists in workforce, implementation, and evaluation. And so we offered the teams some guidance around this, and you can find more information about that in your handouts as well.
Gosh, it sounds like teaming is a really big deal in this project. And I'm interested in talking to Kevin and April about the folks that make up your implementation teams. Kevin, we'll start with you.
Okay.
Kevin Haddock, Oklahoma Department of Human Services.
First of all, there's the project coordinator, which is myself, and then we have a site implementation manager on board. We also have a data coordinator, and of course those are with the QIC group. Then we brought in our additional SACWIS representatives to kind of help with some of the data stuff. We also brought both our internal and external HR folks to really kind of sit down at the table and help us out there. And we brought field representatives. We brought in our program analyst. They're out in the field every day, so they bring a really nice perspective. And we brought in our training team, our internal training team, but also our school social work from the University of Oklahoma has a representative on our team.
Very nice. That's a big group. How about you, April?
Our team is structured a lot like Kevin's. We also have continuous improvement on board. We have leadership from the regions, as well as supervisors and field staff.
Great. And I'm wondering how you selected all of those folks to be on your team.
Kevin replies.
Well, sure. Each one of those guys brings a unique perspective. So they each kind of bring in a new expertise and a kind of a perspective to kind of help with that. So like our kids staff, they have all the data with the kids information and can help us kind of link some of that stuff back to the HR data. We actually already kind of link some of that HR data. Our HR folks, they do a lot of the recruitment already. They do a lot of retention activities at the agency level. You bring in the field staff, obviously they have a lot of good input when it comes to things that are happening with the turnover in child welfare, which is absorbently high. Then you've also got the school social work and the training guys, because training could potentially be a big part of all this.
Absolutely. How about you, April?
April Potts, Washington Department of Children, Youth, and Families.
Ours is pretty similar. Our site implementation manager works 50% on this project, and 50% she'll be managing our program improvement plan following our Child and Family Services review. So that fits nicely. We also have a training manager that is a liaison between our administration and our training arm. We have an HR researcher, which is from the research side of the house, that we can pull both client data and HR data. That's really helpful.
Ida speaks.
Great. So that's a big, like I said, a big group of people. And I'm wondering, we've kind of heard a little bit about the experience in Oklahoma and in Washington. But Megan, I'm wondering, in the other 6 sites, were there other maybe challenges or ideas about how to bring those external stakeholders to the table?
Well, I think there were some issues where people were brought in kind of late, I think, as you got it started, and it was like, oh, we're kind of missing this key component, and so they were brought in additionally. And sometimes, particularly in those circumstances, there were some challenges with people not always being entirely clear on their roles, because maybe they missed, the overview of what the project was really about. And I think that was an important lesson, to make sure everyone's really clear on the purpose of the project and on the purpose of the needs assessment in particular. I mean, certainly we went over those, but it's a little different than they're accustomed to, because having the QIC there, it's different. And the needs assessment process is different, as these guys will attest, that it's much more extensive than they're accustomed to. And typically when people hear about a potential problem that they're responsible for, they just want to say, oh, thanks, great, I'll go take care of that. And it was like, wait, we're looking for areas of opportunity to explore for this project. I think another factor that is important here with all these stakeholders is the agency's culture around open dialogue, and also relationships with stakeholders in terms of how open and honest they are and willing to recognize problems and have shared ownership and talk about those things. So those things can either facilitate or potentially compromise the group's ability to have a really accurate, honest needs assessment. So the team charter was valuable in that we kind of outlined those things and found out where we maybe didn't outline them well enough, but it was a matter of returning to those and reminding people about the purpose of the project, the purpose of the assessment, and their role in each of those things.
Ida speaks.
It sounds like that helped team members understand the value of the project and to really move forward as a unified team. That actually leads us to our first polling question. We are wondering, we'd like to hear from you, and in particular with one of those outside stakeholders, we'd like to hear what is the likelihood of collaboration between HR professionals and child welfare professionals regarding workforce practices in your agency. And that would be on a scale of 1 to 4, 4 being to a great extent, 3 being somewhat, 2 being very little, or 1 being not at all. So if you think about the times that you've addressed workforce issues, brought teams together, because we know you all do that on a regular basis, how likely then are those HR professionals and child welfare professionals coming to the same table? And we know that's not always standard. In fact, we saw that with our site teams. And so we're hoping to hear from you about that. In the meantime, while we're waiting for the poll to come in, what we'd like to do is talk a little bit to Kevin. Kevin, how did you do that to engage the HR professionals that aren't always at the same table?
Yeah, well actually we brought them in right at the application stage. So we brought them on very early on, and quite honestly they were excited. So it made it a lot easier to bring them to the table. But there is always that balance, because you don't want to start to overburden your external stakeholders with a bunch of new work or a bunch of blame or any of that kind of stuff, but you want them to get engaged and stay engaged. So it's been kind of a balance.
I bet. Well, let's take a minute to also talk about Washington's experience in bringing your HR folks to the table.
April answers.
Sure. This project came about at a great time. The last few years, we've really been looking at agency turnover to see what we could do to impact that. We have local action plans that our area administrators have been working on, and we had a 2015 retention work group where they really looked at how do we impact this turnover. And so this further builds on that work that we've started. This year also, our agency went from an umbrella agency within social services where we had to share human resources with other agencies to now July 1st, we started our own agency, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families in Washington State. So that's an opportunity. Prior to this move, though, when we had to share the human resources, we developed a liaison position that was able to work with management within Children's Administration and really troubleshoot areas with hiring. And that person actually was able to collect the data we really needed for this grant application and use a data warehouse. We have a data warehouse where we have historical information. We can pull trends, up-to-date current information on other patterns of turnover that we've used, and it's been really helpful in creating the workforce assessment.
Very nice. And let's take a look at what other folks said. We have 15% coming in at, to a great extent, the HR is involved in some of these initiatives, which is wonderful. 3 is probably more of the trend at 42%, which is somewhat involved in those groups. And then 2, very little, is at 31%, which is also something that we observed in the field. And 1, not at all. Thanks for being honest out there, 12%. I think that in some cases, those folks are siloed or they're the last folks that we think of when we're dealing with our workforce. And so a really important lesson learned that we've had has been to involve those HR folks early, like Kevin said, and often as you're moving along. So I'm wondering, Oklahoma and Washington are both state-administered systems, and I'm wondering if it's a little bit different in a locally administered system. Megan, have other sites experienced anything like that?
Well, actually, it just depends on the sort of configuration and which jurisdiction's leading the charge. So if it's a single county, it's just going to operate the same way as it would in a state. It could be a smaller scale, but it might be larger if it's a really large county compared to some smaller states. So that would be similar. On a single county or locality level, you could invite state office to be partners with them, or you can have counties collaborate with one another. Regardless, what you really need is someone to represent HR in this equation, really is the bottom line. It can be the HR director or a strong representative. The key is we want to have a conduit, a liaison to all the HR processes, whatever they may be. They vary across agencies, of course, but what their role is in recruitment and hiring, and then also conduit to their data, which is really important.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings us to the next step. Once you've put together a robust team and you're really thinking about moving forward as a team and working together, what's the next step?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of data that we're gathering, and you're going to hear more about that in a minute. But I'll just go over briefly the 4 main types of information we looked at. The first is recruiting, hiring, and turnover metrics and processes. And that's a really big bucket of information. This is a recruitment and retention project, and so that's where all these data are housed in that bucket of looking at our outcomes, starting with the end in mind. So we're looking at global measures like overall turnover rate, but lots of more nuanced measures like variation in turnover rate, who's leaving, when are they leaving, from where, lots of combinations of things like that. The second thing we looked at in every site is organizational culture and climate. We used an employee survey to do that. In some sites, we also assess secondary traumatic stress, also through a survey. And then the fourth type of information is other workforce initiatives and processes. And this is also a very large bucket. And this includes things beyond recruiting, hiring, such as onboarding and training and supervision and performance management and mobile options and employee recognition, a really long list of things there. We also really took advantage of employee satisfaction surveys, if the agencies already had those, as well as exit surveys, and those were really instrumental in informing the needs assessment. Again, all this information can be found in your handout, so I encourage you to take a look at those.
Wow, that's a really thorough assessment process. I'm wondering what that experience was like from a site perspective. We'll start with Kevin.
All right, yeah, it was definitely overwhelming. There is a ton of data that we collected. And it was really neat, too, because with all the different perspectives in the room and all these discussions that were happening, and we were really starting to dig into a lot of this data, and we discovered that we wanted more data. And so this kind of continued, and there was a lot of analysis and a lot of being able to look at those perspectives and do a lot of that. And so it showed a lot of different things, and it showed things that we needed to work on, but it also showed things that we were doing well. So it was kind of encouraging in that direction. And so it had also got us all on the same page, you know, with all these different perspectives. But when we had the discussion and everything was data driven, it started to kind of bring everybody into the same kind of line of thought. So it was really encouraging in that way.
Very good. So really it became part of the teaming, it sounds like, looking
Yes.
at these data together.
Exactly.
How about in Washington?
Well, it was exciting and daunting at the same time. A lot of information that we already had at our fingertips, but we just had to dig through and define that. As I mentioned before, we have a 2015 retention work group that they had a lot of information, as well as a very large survey, over 1,500 respondents to that survey. And we have an employee survey that we do every other year. So 2015 and 2017, we had a lot of information for Megan and the team to look through, and over 2,000 comments. Wow. About the workforce that we looked at that was really helpful to combine with our organizational culture and climate survey that the team did. We looked at things, when you would start digging, you would find other, someone would mention a report that was done, so we just continued to dig. There were a lot of one-on-one conversations to find out what else existed. And that mining, I think that you just have to be patient in the process. We looked at worker demographics, how we're training and onboarding around the state. We looked at performance evaluations, how those are being done, and what's included. Current work schedules, whether people are working full-time, part-time, the various work opportunities for alternative work assignments. Telework pilot, we just finished that with our central intake, which was really helpful to add to the information. We look at qualifications and onboarding and recruitment. So all of this really gave us a robust picture. And then it's a matter of getting the team to work through that and to start teasing things out.
Excellent. A lot of data all getting put together that maybe wouldn't have met before.
Exactly.
And so that's a really cool part of the process, I think. I'm wondering from both of you if putting all those data together, if that busted any preconceptions or myths that you might have had about the workforce, or even myths that people on your teams might have had about the workforce.
Oh yes, definitely. It definitely helped me kind of see what was really out there, you know, getting anecdotal information and making some preconceived notions. And I think that lots of members on the team did that, you know, based off the different perspectives that those team members have. They come in, they think, oh, well, turnover's based off of bad supervision. Oh, they just need more training. Oh, all this stuff. And we don't really see eye to eye when we first started. But as we kind of went through this data and got this data from so many different sources, and we're looking at it in ways we'd never looked at it before, it really kind of put us together on the same page as we really kind of started to see what the big picture really was and being data driven about it. So it was really kind of a very exciting time to kind of see all that going along. And as a result of all this collaboration and the fact that we do have all of these different experts and perspectives on the table, I really do think that this is going to be one of the best initiatives that we've had around workforce in Oklahoma. So I'm truly interested in
That's
seeing this
exciting.
together. Yes.
That's really exciting. How about in Washington, April?
Well, I don't think we busted any myths, but we confirmed a lot of the things that we believed we already knew, as well as I think it helped shine a light on areas of opportunity for tracking. We've always talked about CPS having the highest turnover for the workforce, and while CPS accounts for 18% of our workforce in Washington State, the turnover rate is at 26%. So we also found that, a lot of times we're talking about how do we engage millennials. It's a millennial workforce that's leaving, and we found that employees ages 25 to 34 that account for 31% of our workforce have a 39% turnover if you're looking at all the age groups. We know more about when turnover occurs. So within the first year, if you're looking at all of turnover, 42% of that turnover happens within the first year, and then another 25% within the next 2 to 3 years, which is good information to have. If we can keep folks for 3 years, we're doing a lot better. And it also highlighted areas that we need to be tracking. So right now, hiring practices vary across the state. We have 42 offices, field offices, so hiring practices vary across the state. And so there's an opportunity for some consistency, but also tracking. So we should be able to track things about how long does it take to fill a position? What is the time frame from application to hiring? How many applicants are dropping out of the process? And educational data. What's the educational level of people coming into the system, and then another 5 years? Are they, obtaining degrees? Should we be tracking that? So that's just one example of the lens that we thought, well, we have a lot of opportunity to be tracking different data.
Really nice. And I can imagine people scribbling furiously notes on all the data that we've taken a look at. And just as a reminder, that is on one of the resources. There's a really extensive, like Megan mentioned, list of all those data that you can take a look at. But we're interested about whether or not you all have taken a look at your data around some of these areas. And so we'd like to get a feel from all of you using another polling question. Our next polling question is all about data, and it is, what workforce data has your agency previously used to better understand your workforce? And what you can do is check as many of those as apply, and I'll read through those for you. Recruiting data, hiring data, training data, performance data, so once people get in, how they're performing, exit interview data, when people leave, what do they think? Turnover data, employee survey data, like the satisfaction or engagement surveys that we heard folks talking about. Child and family outcomes data, so really even linking that beyond the worker to child and family outcomes. Organizational culture and climate, perhaps using a survey or an instrument to measure organizational culture and climate in your agency. Or for those of you who haven't tackled this area yet, we spend a lot of time looking at child and family outcomes data, and sometimes workforce data can be toward the end, maybe nothing, and that's okay too. And we really ask this opportunity not just as an assessment of everything, but also as a way to maybe prompt your thinking about what data you haven't looked at in a while, or like April mentioned, maybe data you've been collecting, and now maybe it's time to sit down with that and take a look at it. And so your responses are in. We have 3% of folks using recruiting data. 8% of folks answered they used hiring data, same with training data. 5% use performance data, that's great. Exit interviews, it looks like 13% of you are taking a look at those data regularly or have in the past. 8% at turnover data, 8% at employee survey data, and child and family outcomes data and organizational culture and climate at 5%. So lots of opportunities, as you can see, to kind of think through which of those data sources might answer some of the questions that you have about your workforce. And I'm wondering, so we have all this data, Megan, what do we do with it? What happens next?
Yeah, so as they implied strongly, there's a lot of data to go through. So that's the team's job to analyze all of that, bring it together, synthesize it, and kind of boil it down to a few key problem areas or opportunities to explore more deeply through root cause analysis, which, as the name implies, is a standardized process for trying to identify the underlying reasons for a problem. Starting with the problem, the team comes up with sort of a problem statement to succinctly describe it, and then starts exploring symptoms of the problem. That is, what does it look like in practice? And that's actually important to not jump ahead, even though root cause is the goal here, to think about what it looks like in practice, because that can make a difference in terms of what answers you come up with. And then they start through a series of asking repeatedly why, maybe through a 5 whys approach, start drilling down into apparent causes and then get to some root causes. I want to note here that this visual we're showing is oversimplified. A more realistic process would include many sort of branches of causal paths and many root causes. Then the next step is to develop a theory of change, which is a roadmap for addressing the root causes. A theory of change describes how and why changes are expected to lead to the desired long-term outcomes. So you start moving through some preliminary desired outcomes and kind of moving back up through that chain to ensure that you've got good logic for why things will change. So your handouts, again, describe these in further detail, and I acknowledge that this can be a little tedious and overwhelming, as our folks have underscored here. But it's really important to make sure that you've identified the underlying core issues and you have good sound logic for why you expect them to change. Otherwise, you are at risk of spending time and money implementing something that might not work out and you're not even sure why.
It seems like that root cause analysis of really digging in and finding out what the true issues are that are facing your workforce system, and then also a theory of change, that pathway out of the issue, that those two pieces set this really great foundation for selecting an intervention that is useful and does what you intend for it to do. And I think that I just want to highlight that. I think that's a really great point. And I want to, since you've taken part in this process, or we're right in the middle of it right now in the sites, I'm wondering from Kevin and April if you've gone through that process, or maybe you're in the process of selecting an intervention, what you've selected and why.
Okay, yeah, it was a great process. It was daunting. It was a big process, but it was really good. You know, all of our players were kind of all together and really kind of moving in sync. And what it allowed us to do was you could see the root cause. Once you go through this process, it really highlighted what the true cause was, or at least one major one for us in Oklahoma. So it got us all on the same page as exactly what that is. But it also gave us the data. It gave us the kind of the resources behind it so that we could articulate why it was that this was actually the thing that kind of jumped right out, that this is what we need to do.
Very nice. How about in Washington, April?
Well, Oklahoma's a little further along in the process than we are. We have begun the root cause, which is really helpful. I think the biggest challenge in trying to get to the root is keeping people from wanting to jump to solution, because I think we're all just wired to want to find a solution, but it really takes a lot of time and patience to ask why and get to the bottom. I brought one of the problems that we worked on, identified problems, just to talk through a little bit of our experience. So alternative work arrangements are limited or inconsistently used, and staff are dissatisfied. So they're inconsistently used statewide or not at all. And why is that? So some of that is the regions have autonomy to either choose to use alternative work arrangements or not. People worry about, supervisors especially, and management worry about overtime. That was one of the reasons identified that, that needs to be pre-approved, and there's a process for that. So worried if you don't have on-site your employees, then there may be opportunity to work overtime. Performance will suffer, again, if you don't have that typical work environment, if there's alternative arrangements, maybe performance will suffer, or that supervisors don't have the knowledge or training to supervise remotely. And then further, we asked why of those things further, and I think themes emerge when we're asking, and one is there just isn't clear policy around that. And I think this is a great opportunity for our new agency where we have HR on board and to talk about what is our expectation for alternative work arrangements. And I think that work has already begun in the new agency. And fear, if we're used to a sort of a set work arrangement, and there's a lot of fear with litigation, or again, how do I know what my workers are doing, or what if they need my support and help and I'm not available? So there's a lot of fear. So that's one example of one of the root causes that we looked at in the process.
Very nice. And so you haven't yet selected an intervention. Do you know where the intervention might be going in Oklahoma, Kevin?
Yes, Oklahoma has selected a selection intervention. And what I mean by that is that we're going to be looking at our hiring and making sure that we're actually hiring the right people. Child welfare work is really hard. It is a very, very tough job, and not everybody's cut out for it. So we really need to make sure that when we have our interview questions set up, when we have the people who are actually performing the interviews, that we're selecting based off the right criteria. We've done really well with selecting for the competencies that it takes to actually do child welfare work. But are we selecting the people that are prone to burnout? Are we selecting people who can handle the stress of the work in child welfare? Are we able to handle the people that can handle the crazy scheduling that child welfare workers often have? So do their values line up with the agency values? Or because that's a kind of a conflict there that can cause a lot of stress and create turnover. So we're really going to start looking at that, and our thought process is that if we get the right people at the beginning, they'll stay and be better and more efficient workers and have a better, stronger workforce in the long run. That's
a good point. This work is a balance of values, as we heard from Jill this morning. And so I think thinking through how we're selecting and hiring is an exciting opportunity for Oklahoma. So it'll be interesting to see how that moves forward. What I'm wondering is, just as you've talked about all these experiences, if you're talking to another child welfare agency who's out there, maybe trying to be at the very beginning of this and taking on a similar task, I'm wondering what you might recommend for them. Kevin?
Get as many experts from as many different perspectives as possible right up front. Because having them all on board at the beginning, it will really help you guys be able to, first of all, figure out where you're off. You have expertise in many different areas, because this work actually went and we combined data from things I never would have put together beforehand. And it really took having those experts in the room to be able to help us figure out what we needed next and what data were we missing, or how does that data need to be interpreted. So get them involved up front. It really does help. I know that can be also very daunting and very stressful, and sometimes you want the smaller groups, but in this case, to do something this large and this impactful, you need to get them up front.
Very good. How about in Washington, April?
Well, before I jump into the recommendations, I wanted to say Washington, as far as our interventions, you've selected yours. We haven't gotten that far. We're still looking at 3 potential, and those are hiring, work schedules, as I mentioned, that was one of the root causes we looked at, and employee recognition. Because we're transitioning to a new agency and we have a lot of challenges and opportunities with the transition, we wanted to narrow and to those 3 because some of the other opportunities we just thought it wasn't a good time with the transition. So hiring, really looking at interviewing and sorting on the front end, much like what Oklahoma has selected. Washington feels that in most cases, the larger offices anyway, we don't really have a hard time with applicants, the number of applicants, although that isn't the case in rural areas. It's really about the process, a consistent process to sort and hire. And alternate work schedules and telework. In Washington State, our governor in 2016 signed an executive order that really encouraged innovative practices in the state workplace, looked at alternative work arrangements. So we have that support from the state system as well as the new agency, our new agency management. And the third focus is staff recognition, which is really important. I feel like our workforce, constantly, whether it's media or otherwise, we kind of get beat down a bit. And we know through our 2015 retention work group, as well as our ongoing employee surveys, that staff just feel that lack of support systemically. It's not about their supervisor. We have many comments in our evaluations that speak to the support of their peers and their coworkers and supervisors. But as they move up the chain, there's less and less sort of connection and that feeling of support. So what can we do about that from a systems perspective? It feels like to our staff that we're more compliance driven and less focused on quality, which we want to get away from. So it's really good to have that information. But as far as readiness, I think getting agency leadership on board early, because they can really leverage the work and help identify a path forward. In any endeavor, it's important to communicate, and you can't communicate enough. We've really tried to communicate through memos. Our assistant secretary, who's now our field operations director, has a regular webinar where she chats with the field staff and others in regional management just about what's going on. So we have planned next month to have a chat with someone who's been in the agency for a long time. Why do they stay? And that really is to build buy-in so that people are more interested in hearing about this project and the work we're doing. But I think even when you think you've communicated enough, to communicate more. There's always opportunities. And this process takes time and effort and patience. It's not a quick process. We were hoping to have our intervention selected by July, but we're not there. And so instead of rushing again to a solution, it's really important that people take time. And I think staying curious through the data. It feels daunting and overwhelming, but just what more can we learn from this? And having those questions.
Yeah, that root cause analysis where you ask why, the curiosity. I can imagine that led to some good conversations.
For sure.
In both agencies. So we've talked about a lot today, and I'm wondering just overall, if you think about our entire session and what we've learned so far, what can our audience take away as just little tidbits if they're doing the same thing or thinking about it, just with regard to assessing their workforce and then developing and selecting an intervention. I'll start with Megan, and then I'll move through Kevin and April.
Well, there's lots of tidbits in the handouts, so more than people probably want. But in terms of main points, I think the main one that we've underscored here a couple times is that the process is comprehensive in multiple ways. It's comprehensive in the sense that you've got lots of different people at the table, and so you get to have those different perspectives come together. And for me, the main one is having HR at the table, because that's what often gets missed. And I see that frequently where it's like, oh, I don't know, they're in another building, they're somewhere else. We don't really, it's just a matter of through data systems is our only connection to them. The process is also comprehensive in terms of breadth and depth. An agency wouldn't have to have such breadth. We kind of looked under every rock, as you can probably hear from what we're saying. But so an agency could start much smaller and doesn't need to have such a broad scope. We need it to. But I think depth is the other important comprehensiveness, and I wouldn't skip that part. Going through that root cause analysis and theory of change is important. Again, let's see, just to emphasize about the root cause part and how much time and effort you could waste if you're not doing that. No one in child welfare has a surplus of time or money, so we want to spend it wisely and not have rush to put something into place and out of a sense of urgency, which I think is quite common. And lastly, I think that the data are comprehensive because it's both objective from your data systems, but also subjective to the extent that you can get surveys and get the voice of your frontline staff, and that those are, driving decision making and sort of grasping at straws.
Yeah, it seems like the group is almost interpreting the data.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. How about you, Kevin?
Yeah, I would have to say the data. It's probably the single most important thing. It's something that you do have to show a lot of patience with, as April was saying, because you are going to be combining things that you've never done before. But the data for us in Oklahoma, I think, is what, and being data-driven in every decision that we made, and all of our discussions being really data-focused and data-driven, is what got the collaboration together. Because the data will tell you what it tells you, and so using it to drive the direction of the discussions and of the project is really key.
Because people come in with all kinds of ideas when they're coming around the table. Everyone has an idea about why they think the workforce is. Yes, exactly. How about in Washington, April?
Well, I think data is important, but to also build relationships with HR and others and the frontline staffs. And people know why we're doing this and how it's going to impact them. We found, too, with our meetings, it's hard sometimes for frontline folks to be at every meeting. So finding ways to get their input and engagement, so that it's not a burden. Whether that's we've done webinar and phone conferences, surveys. So using a wide variety of ways to really get that input.
Really good. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences today, for sharing expertise that comes from the center. I'm hoping that the audience has benefited in some way and maybe has some ideas about the work that they might want to do in their agencies to do potentially a similar process or even a portion of this process to guide their work. I'm going to transition a little bit. What's going to happen is we're going to be transitioning into the virtual reflections stage of this part of the program, and that'll be an opportunity for you all to reflect on what we've discussed. We will have folks and representatives from the Quality Improvement Center on Workforce Development there to guide you through that process. And then in a minute, your screen is going to change as you automatically then move into the virtual learning lab. So don't be alarmed, but if you encounter any issues, you want to return to the theater and then access the learning lab under the Virtual Reflections tab. That's how you get there if you get lost. Please note that the Virtual Reflections worksheet that you'll be filling out during the Virtual Reflections time period is available to download in that Resources tab, where you'll find all the other resources that we've been discussing today. That's a pod, actually, not a tab. Feel free to use that worksheet to document any takeaways that you have from the session today. We also really want your feedback. So please share your feedback using the session evaluation. I know that the center cares very much about continually improving their process, and so they want to hear from you. And then one more thing, a couple more things actually, the virtual message board. If you go there, please share why you work in child welfare, what keeps you, what makes you stay. And that's using hashtag #ShareYourWhy, so we can go in there and take a look at those collectively. It's a fun activity. And then you can also join our virtual chat session in the Collaboration for Change booth in the exhibit hall, which starts at 1 p.m. Eastern. Finally, our next workshop, which is the Simulation Innovations, It's Not Just Role Play Anymore, that sounds like a good one, will begin at 1:30 p.m., and that's Eastern time, of course. So thank you so much for participating today, and we really look forward to seeing you in the Virtual Reflections booth.
Logo for the Child Welfare Virtual Expo 2018.